The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, a look at what's making air travel in Canada a costly endeavor. Then, Jayan Jagannathan and author Jamie Chai Yun Liew discuss her new book, Ghost Citizens. That's ahead on the agenda. Do Canadian travelers pay more for air travel than their counterparts in other countries? If so, what might be driving the higher cost? And is increased competition a possible answer? To help us unpack the complicated price of your airline ticket, we welcome in Calgary, Alberta, Jake Fuss. He's Director of Fiscal Studies at the Fraser Institute. In Montreal, Quebec, Jacob Charbonneau, co-founder and CEO of Flight Claim. That's a claims processing firm. In the nation's capital, Andrew Gibbons, Vice President, Government Relations and Regulatory Affairs at WestJet, and Manette Pasher, President of the Canadian Airports Council. And we're delighted to have you four on TVO tonight to help us understand why we pay what we pay when we travel by air in this country and abroad. Andy, I'm going to go to you first. Why are the issues in the airline sector as they relate to the regulator and the government apparently coming to a boil these days?
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me. I think they're coming to a boil because post-COVID, we're in an affordability crisis, we're in an inflation crisis, and fundamentally aviation has a user pay model that asks Canadian travelers to pay the fees associated with their infrastructure, their security, and all other areas of their journey. And increasingly, this is inconsistent with other modes of travel. And the problem that is occurring is that a large segment of the population is being priced out of the opportunity of experiencing air travel. And everyone wants affordability and everyone wants air travel to be democratized. So I think there's an emerging view that this is being threatened. And of course, there's disagreements on what the answer to that should be and what the prescription should be. But I think that's why things are coming to a boil.
We'll look into some of that as we continue our conversation. Manette, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a good model here in Canada, but of course, everything could always use some improvements. And I think, that's why we've been working with the government and asking governments of any stripe to improve the regulatory burden. Each new regulation that's added adds cost to the system. And I think because we've chosen a user pay model in Canada instead of a taxpayer model, obviously that puts more burden on the actual users of the system. And that's what we see in this country. And I think we need to look at aviation and say, this isn't a system that's just for users. It's an essential good. Like, people want to travel by air. People need to travel by air. We need it for our supply chain. So I think we need to strike that right balance of what is, users and someone going on a sun trip and what is essential to our Canadian economy.
Jake, do we need some policy reform here?
I think absolutely. I mean, if we look at our system right now, we don't have a lot of competition in the airline sector. And on top of that, I think more so than there actually being a problem with a user pay model, which I would actually disagree with in terms of switching to a taxpayer model. I think actually looking at how we own and operate our airport systems across Canada is actually a huge problem as well. Currently, we have a not-for-profit authorities that pay rents to the federal government. Other countries around the world, if you look at Auckland Airport or Sydney Airport, these are actually privately owned airports that are for-profit, sometimes publicly listed, that are much better able to control their costs over time. And I also think we put in a lot of restrictions and rules from the federal government on airlines and on airports in Canada that actually make it very hard for us to lower prices for consumers over time.
Jake, can you just follow up on that and help our viewers and listeners understand better the difference between a user pay model and a taxpayer model, and which you would prefer and why?
Sure. So a user pay model is typically where you have the consumers directly pay for the costs of the services, for the upgrading of infrastructure. So all of those costs are going to be borne in your actual ticket price that you're paying at the end of the day. So airport authorities, for instance, will have things like airport improvement fees that are actually added on to your bills. So these can be anywhere from about $25 per passenger all the way up to over $40 per passenger. But there's other fees and taxes that are also assessed on top of that. Whereas a taxpayer model would typically be you're subsidized by governments, or some of that cost of the infrastructure is actually paid for by taxpayers, and not the entire cost is actually borne by the users directly. So I think there's a lot of drawbacks actually in the taxpayer model. There might be, some aspect of having infrastructure being paid for by taxpayers, but generally you don't want taxpayers to actually be subsidizing somebody else using, flights over time as well, because then they're not actually the ones benefiting from those flights from business travel, for instance, from Toronto to Montreal. Somebody in rural Manitoba, it doesn't make a lot of sense for them to actually be subsidizing another person's flight costs. So that's why I think there's a bit of a drawback there, and that's why I think there should also be a discussion about how we're owning and operating the airports and getting more competition in this space.
Jacob, how do you see it?
Well, obviously, I think there's some decisions that have been made when we privatized Air Canada back in '88, so more than 36 years ago, in two ways. So for the user pay model, so every fee is sent back to the customer, but also we decided to have a less player in Canada, but strong player, which means that now we end up with essentially a duopoly of airlines, which means less competition and less improvement on the price.
Okay, Jake, do you think, excuse me, not Jake, I want to go to Andy on this. Is it fair to say that basically your airline and Air Canada have basically divided up the country and having fewer big players? I should add Porter to the list, but Porter is more of a regional thing than a national carrier like you and Air Canada are. Having fewer big players, do you think that's been the better way to go for Canada?
Well, I don't accept the premise about dividing the country, Steve. I was just in Atlantic Canada last week. We launched new routes in Newfoundland and Labrador. We're connecting them to Europe for the first time in 5 years. I was in Halifax, where we announced the return of transatlantic flights to Paris. So actually across the Eastern Canada, we've been adding strategic flights over and over again since we've launched our growth strategy. So I just don't accept that. We're a national airline. We have key investments everywhere. In terms of how many large players there are, in 1996 when WestJet started, that wasn't because anyone in Ottawa passed a law. It wasn't because anyone wrote a report. It was because our founders felt that Canadians were paying too much to travel. And we are the company that has democratized air travel in Canada. And we're very proud of that. So our standing is quite unique in this discussion. Nothing has stopped Porter from ordering their airplanes and attempting to build a national competitor. And nothing has stopped Lynx and other entrants from coming into the market. So we've actually seen our domestic market share slightly go down, and Air Canada's has actually gone down over the last few years. And our dominant carrier in Canada is Air Canada, and their market share is less, I think, than it's ever been. So there is strong competition in this market, and we're continually innovating both our product side and where we fly, but no, we haven't left any part of the country as WestJet.
Monette, what's your view on whether we have enough players in this country to keep prices where consumers would like to see them?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Andy in that we're seeing more competition now in our air sector than we've ever had before. And I think that's good news for Canadians. The more competition that we have on routes, the more we see prices go down. We used to call it the WestJet effect. Lately, it's the Flair effect. And I think whenever we see more than one carrier on a route and we see Porter expanding, this is good news. And I think that will lead to lower fares over time. Our airports represent communities across this country. And to be clear, I'm not advocating for a taxpayer model at all. I'm just saying we need to strike the right balance. Our view is that this model in Canada works quite well as a user pay model. So I do think that there's always room for improvements and tweaks.
Well, we're going to see how well it works when I talk to Jacob because he's with Flight Claim, and the backlog of complaints with the Canadian Transportation Agency is fairly robust. Let me ask you, Jacob, how easy or hard it is to make a claim for compensation when you've had a problem.
Oh, it's not really easy in all cases. So the system is quite broken here in Canada. So we need to understand that when a passenger get a flight disruption, he has to go through and ask for compensation to the air carrier, which are both judge and jury. So they make the decision to pay or not, but it's also money that's come out of their pocket. And there's some loophole right now into the regulation and a lot of place for interpretation. And as well, it's like if we put speed limit on the road, but there's no one monitoring if the airlines follow those policies. It's working with the CTA, but only based on complaint. So when passengers actually go through and ask to the CTA to review the file, well, now they have 84,000 files in the backlog with more than 18 to 24 months of wait. So for those air passengers that want to go through that process, and it's about 91% of the Canadians that won't go through their claim process because it's too long, it's too complicated. They don't even know if they're entitled to that compensation. Well, they will have to wait that amount of time to get that compensation. So it's like if we encourage a little bit the bad behavior of our airlines right now.
Andy, do you want to come in on that?
I sure do. I think the only thing I'd agree with Jacob on is that the 2-year wait time at the CTA is completely unacceptable for our guests. So just so your viewers know this, and you, Steve, 98.5% of complaints that our company receives never see the regulator. They're dealt with within 30 days. You are either entitled to compensation or you are not. There's a very, very small percentage that feel compelled to go to the regulator. And we've been pushing Ottawa for a couple of years now to improve their administration. So we don't want anyone waiting 1 day more than they should for compensation. And I just reject that we're a bad faith actor here. That's not correct. We solve complaints within 30 days. We're mandated to do so, and we're pleased to do so. But it's a bigger problem. The problem is that these rules are confusing, and they're confusing to interpret for us, and they're confusing to interpret for the guests. But also, we don't want what happens in Europe. We don't want a $6 billion insurance scheme that doesn't improve service. The goal should be singularly, how do we make sure that air travel is the most accessible, is efficient, and there's value for travelers. So our goal is to improve the system so that we don't have a discussion about a backlog. There should be no backlog. There should be very, very few complaints. That's everyone's goal. But if we don't improve the system, that's not going to happen. If we just continue to airline bash, guess what? That's not going to happen either. So I think everyone's got to unite here on what the actual goal is of the system.
Well, let me, just for the heck of it here, tell you what the Canadian Transportation Agency had to say about all this, because they've put out a statement about their attempts to put together updated regulations, which they hope will improve things. And I'll ask our director, Sheldon Osman, to bring this up, and I will read along for those listening on podcast. The agency says it's important to note that the Canadian Transportation Agency has held a first phase of consultations on proposed changes to the air passenger protection regulations in the summer of 2023, during which it received significant substantive input, including from airlines, as well as consumer organizations, passenger advocates, academics, and the general public. The Canadian Transportation Agency has to take all of these comments into consideration while preparing proposed amendments to the air passenger protection regulations. The next step is for a draft of the proposed regulations to be published in the Canada Gazette Part 1 for another round of public consultation. Following this, the Canadian Transportation Agency will have to consider the submissions that it has received. There is no timeline for when the draft proposals will be made public. Jake, react to that if you would.
Sure. Well, I think one of the biggest problems right now is that customer complaints actually reached an all-time high earlier this year. And I think a big actual reason why that's occurring is because of a lack of competition in our airline sector. If you have more competition and you don't like a specific airline and you have complaints about that airline, then you can actually go to another airline to actually be better serviced, for instance. But in Canada, we have very few options for that. And I think the main reason why is really two actual aspects in terms of federal policies. First, there's actual rules that are placed on what we call cabotage rules in Canada. So international airlines are not actually able to operate within Canada by flying from one city to the next. So if they fly to Toronto, for instance, they either have to return back to the country that they came from or go to another country. They're not allowed to then fly to Vancouver, for instance.
Should we change those rules?
I think absolutely. If we look at Europe, for instance, they actually have what we call full cabotage. So an Irish airline, for instance, can operate inside of Germany and they can fly to another German city without having to fly back to Ireland. And the same thing vice versa for a German airline would be able to operate within Ireland. And then the second actual restriction that's placed as well is in terms of foreign ownership of airlines in Canada as well. So only foreign investors can only own up to 49% of Canadian airlines currently, and individual foreign investors can only own 25% of Canadian airlines. This actually is a very high barrier to entry because it's you need significant capital to actually compete in the airline sector, especially for low-cost carriers and new entrants into the market. So this actually adds to a lot of the cost that's going on in the Canadian airline sector as well.
Okay, let's get some feedback on this. Manette, I'm going to go to you first. This notion of cabotage, that you could actually be opening up the airwaves over Canada a lot more, encouraging more intercity flights by international carriers. That would be more competition. That would bring prices down. What do you say?
Yeah, first, Steve, I just wanted to weigh in on the APPR because this is something that's impacting communities, and it's impacting communities already across this country, and we need government to get it right. So I say take your time, take their time hearing from industry, hearing from communities, because what's in place right now is too expensive for the industry. And it's not striking that right balance of protecting passengers, but also making sure that the sector can thrive. We're seeing communities across the country that have air service 3 times a week. Their service is being cut because the risk is too high to some of our low-cost carriers like Flair. I've seen that happen this fall, and we're going to see more of that happen if these changes come into place. So I would say take your time, study this, and make sure we get that right.
Now on cabotage?
Yeah, on cabotage, this is something that's been studied extensively. We need to be very careful in what we're looking at in Canada. Of course, we want more competition, and of course, we want the right competition that works for our marketplace. We need to look at this objectively. We're not Europe, right? And air travel is a volume game. Our population is 40 million. It's about the same size as the state of California, but we're 25 times the land mass. So if we're to bring some of these other carriers in, some of them state funded, what would that mean to our existing carriers? I think, we need to look at all these aspects and make sure that we're making the right decision for communities across Canada. We have population bases that are really spread out that don't have the connectivity that they need now for their economies to thrive. So these are very complicated questions that need to be studied and considered very closely.
I see Andy nodding his head, so let me, before getting Andy to weigh in, go back to Jake and say, if Manette's right, and it's not a level playing field out there because some of our domestic carriers are competing against state-owned enterprises, there is an unfairness in that. Do you have any concerns about recommending wider, more open cabotage when it may not be a level playing field?
Not necessarily, because ultimately the goal is to actually lower costs for consumers over time. Now, ultimately, you are going to compete on an unlevel playing field with certain state-owned operators, but the actual end goal is to lower prices for consumers by allowing more competition in the market. And governments can also choose, make regulations in terms of what they're allowing into the country in terms of different international airlines as well. So they can have a role to play there. But I don't buy the argument about population density in Canada. If we look at a similar country like Australia as well, they have a much more competitive system for their airlines with low-cost carriers in their country as well. And they have a very similar population density, like I mentioned. So yes, Europe is obviously influenced by their population density, and they have a lot of competition in that market. But part of that is also allowing a lot of international airlines into the market to actually lower prices for consumers over time.
Andy, come on in on that if you would.
Yeah, just on APPR, a quick note, if you don't mind. These proposals that they've put forward on APPR and cost recovery, honestly, I've worked in aviation for 20 years. I've never seen proposals more rejected than these two that have been proposed. And not by airlines, by communities, by airports, as Manette says, by premiers. No one wants to increase the cost of travel at this time. Everyone, of course, wants to protect consumers, and so do we. But I just want to be clear, those proposals have been so thoroughly rejected and discredited in their ability to actually fix what's wrong, and that's why they haven't proceeded. On cabotage, look, that's a trade issue. I hope that Jake advocates for our right to fly between American cities. We want to be as strong as possible, as profitable as possible, and I just reject this Canadian mentality that the answer to Canadian aviation is something found somewhere else. We need to lower the cost of production for us, We need to improve our ability to be profitable. And as an order of magnitude, if you look at Canada, Steve, there's 7 million Canadians that take flights from border airports. And the reason is not that WestJet doesn't have a good product that's of high value, or Air Canada or anyone else. It's because of taxes and regulations. So we need to fix that. And if you look at Lynx Airlines went bankrupt early this year, they didn't, if anyone thinks Lynx Airlines would exist today, if Emirates could fly between Halifax and Toronto, I mean, it's absurd, right? So we need to fix the core. We shouldn't be talking about what color the blinds should be in the bedroom when the foundation of the system needs critical work.
Okay, here's something from the Competition Bureau, and again, this is from Matthew Boswell, the Commissioner of Competition, who sent this in an email, and we'll put this on the record for everybody's edification. Sheldon, the graphic, if you would. Air travel is a critical service, and we know many Canadians are frustrated by the cost and quality of the service being provided domestically. To better understand competition issues in the industry, we launched a market study to examine what changes can be made to improve competition in passenger air travel in Canada. Our focus is to determine whether a lack of competition is driving these issues and on the steps governments can take to make it easier for new businesses to compete and innovate. It is too early to determine what our conclusions might be. However, once the study is complete, we'll publish a final report with recommendations to all levels of government to improve competition in the airline industry. Okay, let me go to Jacob. I haven't heard from you in a bit. Do you want to weigh in on this issue and tell us whether you believe, well, what do you read into that statement from the Competition Bureau?
Yeah, kind of agree. When we look at the punctuality level of our airline here in Canada and North America, we're always on the low bottom tiers of punctuality, and we're not trying to improve that much. When we look at our neighbors down south in the U.S., the airline are way more punctual, and they're trying to improve because there's way more competition. So the overall competitiveness will make an impact on the overall service that the customer get.
Okay, let's talk travel distances here. And how do we want to approach this? Okay, Andy, let me get you in first on this. Montreal to Iqaluit's 2,000 kilometers. I bet you a lot more people would like to see the far north of this country. But of course, that is a route not particularly well traveled. And as a result, I'm guessing it costs a fortune. Do you know off the top of your head how much Montreal to Iqaluit would cost?
We're not fortunate enough to serve that route, so it's not one that's in my Rolodex of current fares in my brain. But look, domestic travel can be expensive in Canada.
I'm going to guess it's $2,500. It might even be more than that. It might be $3,000. Is there, I don't know, is there anything you think ought to be done? I don't know whether it's taxpayer subsidy or it's some other idea that could encourage Canadians to see more of their own country as opposed to, sometimes it's $300 to go to London, England, for example.
Yeah, I mean, this is at the heart of our submission to the Competition Bureau, that the government should work very actively to reduce their fees. So we came out in the spring and we said airport rents should not be collected. We said government fees should be frozen. And part of the reason for that is what we hear from communities. What we hear from communities is, why does the government tax our essential mode of transport while rail and marine and the Confederation Bridge and others are frozen? So we're not subsidy seekers, but there's a fundamental question here for rural and remote and smaller Canadian communities, which is the inequity between how that transportation is treated by the government and how other modes are. You said off the top of the show, you live in downtown Toronto, work in downtown Toronto. You have plenty of options to get to Ottawa and Montreal. You can drive, you can take the bus, you can take Via. You got a host of options before you. If you live in Fort St. John, British Columbia, or Wabush, or Goose Bay, or Iqaluit, it is air that is your essential mode. So these communities are starting to say, why are we treated differently? Why is our essential mode something that the government of Canada generates revenue from? So increasingly people are saying that's just not right. And that's why we've called for a review of the whole thing, because we just think it needs a full rethink.
Monette, how would you do things differently in order to potentially encourage Canadians to see more of their own country, because it would be less prohibitively expensive to do so?
Yeah, I think this is less about, someone being able to take a vacation and more about the really vital role air travel plays in our country. If you look at Nunavut, it's 25 fly in, fly out communities, or you look at Labrador, like they need that air access in order to be able to do medical appointments, to get their goods delivered in their communities. This is essential air service. It's their only way in and out. So I do think, it's not up to airlines to provide that service if they can't make the business work. I think that's part of this that needs to be looked at, to say what part of air travel is a social good and what role does government play in that essential service in order for these communities to have the access that they need and the goods and services that they need. Other countries have essential air service programs, for example. It's something we've never had in Canada. Our airports were privatized 30 years ago, and we've never seen the government put in an essential air service program for some of our smaller communities in the north that really do require it. So I think there is many things that we could look at. That's one. So is an infrastructure program for some of these smaller airports. They created the Airport Capital Assistance Program 30 years ago when they privatized airports, as they recognized that some of these small airports wouldn't be able to pave their runways and do some of this work, and it wouldn't be commercially viable. It's 30 years later, and the $38 million in that program does not go a long way. It might pave one runway. So I think we're challenged in terms of infrastructure investment into our essential airport assets. When you're talking about small airports in rural communities, they really do require partnership in that.
Jacob, have you got a view how we could improve this?
Yeah, I do agree with Monette. We cannot rely on private company to offer essential services down north. Obviously, there should be regulation around it and some government program.
Okay, we've got just a few minutes left here. And Jake, let me get you on this. Do we need a new regulatory environment around the airline industry in this country? And if so, what's job one?
Yes, I definitely think we need to change how we're regulating the environment. And I do agree with Andy's earlier comments about fees and taxes being a very prohibitive cost right now to airlines, and ultimately those costs are being passed on to consumers. So I think we need to revisit how we're actually handling our fees and taxes in that sector, because there's just a myriad of taxes and fees that are added on top of that. And then we also need to look at our foreign ownership regulations, the cabotage rules as well in Canada, and ultimately getting to how our airport authorities are actually owned and operated, looking to the example of other countries like New Zealand and Australia that actually have a different model, and some European countries as well, where a lot of these airports are actually privately operated. They have better incentives to actually lower costs for consumers over time, and this actually leads to more competition, better prices for consumers, and an overall better air travel experience in terms of cost and quality of service as well.
Andy, I take your point that we don't want to unilaterally disarm in this country unless we know that we're going to get equal treatment in other countries as well. Let me just ask you finally whether, the king of tariffs is about to come into office in a couple of months. Can you imagine us making any progress on these kinds of cross-border issues, given the inflammatory tone that's coming out of Washington these days?
Maybe in another life I was a professor of international affairs, but look, it's a period of uncertainty for everyone. But, we are the number one air carrier in so many U.S. markets, and the Canadian economy is so dependent on U.S. tourists. So everyone hopes and expects that's going to continue unabated because so many jobs are dependent on it. And we've expanded so much between the Canada and the U.S. in the last year, from Saskatchewan and Winnipeg and the two Alberta airports. So, everyone is dependent on this relationship, whether it's inbound tourism or any other product. So, we can't just hope for the best. I think everyone's engaged in the conversation and making sure that, the things that we depend on from our neighbors continue.
Manette, last 30 seconds to you. Let me put it this way. We've been worried so much about what will happen to the auto industry, what will happen to agriculture in this country, what will happen to numerous other goods that are traded over the border. Hadn't even thought about airline tickets. If Donald Trump wants to put 25% tariffs on everything, does that mean airline tickets as well? And what does that potentially mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all watching what's happening with those tariffs, and I think we'll be watching that closely. But I wanted to take my last 30 seconds to talk about our airports being privatized and what was just raised. I think people need to realize that our airports in Canada were already privatized. They were privatized 30 years ago. They're already commercial entities. The only difference between here and Australia is that the operational surpluses from our airport revenues actually go back into the infrastructure and not into shareholders' pockets. We've extensively studied this, and I think, our model is advantageous. There's some in Australia that would love to see what happens here in Canada because we have a higher capital intensity ratio. The difference between here and Australia is they don't have our winters, and I'm sure you've seen Calgary and Edmonton have already had snow, and it is a big portion of our cost in terms of our airport costs. So I think there's many good elements of our airport model. And I think when we're only about 12% of the cost of a ticket, of the average ticket in Canada, I think the issue is as government adds regulation, it's adding cost and adding complexity to our system. And we need to look at this overall and say, how can we make this better for consumers?
That was a little more than 30 seconds, Minette, but you said it so well, I'll let you get away with it. I want to thank all four of you for coming onto our airwaves tonight and helping us out with this. Jake Fuss from the Fraser Institute in the top left corner, Andy Gibbons from WestJet in the top right corner, Minette Pasher from the Canadian Airports Council in the bottom left, and Jacob Charbonneau, Flight Claim. It's great to have you all on TVO tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
What does it mean to be stateless? And how can a person end up as a citizen of nowhere? Author Jamie Chai Yun Liew explores these questions in her new book, Ghost Citizens, Decolonial Apparitions of Stateless, Foreign, and Wayward Figures in Law. She's also a professor of law at the University of Ottawa, and she joins us in studio for more. Hello, Jamie.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining us in studio. Let's start off right off the bat with a definition. What is a ghost citizen?
A ghost citizen is a term I use to describe stateless people, people without citizenship to any country whatsoever, who live in a country that they consider their home, but for whatever reason, they aren't able to get the legal documentation or the confirmation that they are citizens of the place that they reside in.
I think for a lot of Canadians and Ontarians, the idea of being born in a place and not having citizenship or paperwork associated might be mind-boggling for them. How does a person become stateless?
In various ways. So people can become stateless by virtue of just not having registered their birth. In some countries, you don't get citizenship by being born in territories, but you have to prove that you meet the requirements, such as you have a parent or a guardian that is has citizenship in that country. Mm-hmm. So some people might lose it because they aren't able to establish that they have the requirements or the links, or they might have lost documentation. Some tragic stories about documents getting lost in the shuffle over generations of people, or just having a fire in their home and losing very important documentation. So there's a variety of ways in which people become stateless.
All right, I want to read a little excerpt from your book. It reads, some parents have not told their children that they are stateless for fear of how it would affect their mental health or their interactions with others in their community. Further, stateless persons recounted their experiences through tears, regret, and frustration, asking why they could not be treated like a community member or a fellow human being. They invariably expressed their surprise when they were treated like a foreigner or as someone who has committed fraud. So help us understand this. So not all stateless people know they're stateless.
Yeah.
How does that come to be?
A huge proportion of stateless people around the world are children because they're born and are not given citizenship by the country of their birth, or their parents aren't able to register or obtain citizenship for them. And many of the parents that I've talked to in my research told me that they understand what it would do to a child because of the stress they themselves feel in terms of trying to access things like education, healthcare, and other services for their children. And they don't want their children to have to feel different or experience any bullying or backlash from that lack of citizenship. And so their parents, guard that information and, if possible, try to help them navigate the world. But it usually hits a snag at some point because, children grow, as you know, and need to access things on their own. And it's sometimes become a very tragic story about how children learn that they have become stateless as a result of, I would say errors or badly structured laws.
Well, let's talk about it. You talk about the role of parents. I want to talk about the role of government. The term gaslighting has become very popular recently, but you use it to refer to states and their stateless residents. In your view, how are governments gaslighting stateless people?
Yeah, there's, the title of my book, Ghost Citizens, really kind of encapsulates the major findings of my research, which is the first thing is states were kind of ghosting. So many of your listeners or viewers of this show might understand it from the dating scene where somebody just completely cuts off contact or does not respond to any communication from a person that you might have gone on a date with. And so states are doing this to stateless people. People might put in citizenship applications or they might make queries or ask for assistance from government officials, and they're simply not getting any answers, or they're getting wrong answers or taking down paths that aren't going to get them citizenship, or they're just being told, listen, you're not of our concern. We're not going to help you because we don't believe you are one of us. So, this term of ghost citizen really encapsulates the experience of people who have been told, you're not one of us. We're not going to help you. We're going to deny you citizenship. And on the flip side, while they're denying and ghosting these people, they're also gaslighting their experience in the sense that they're telling them, you're actually a citizen of elsewhere.
Somewhere else.
You're a foreigner, your citizenship is an issue with another country, and you're not our problem. And it's curious because most people have very weak or tangential links to other countries. And usually the state will point to, well, your mother is a citizen of Thailand, of China, other countries. And this is absent any evidence that they are eligible or have been conferred citizenship elsewhere.
Very interesting. You have a personal connection to this issue because of your father. Can you tell us a little bit about his story?
Yeah, my father was born stateless. He was born in a country called Brunei, and he was stateless for the first 25 years of his life, I would say. And, it affected him profoundly. He used to tell me when I was younger that he was stateless and how it made him feel, how he, was denied opportunities for further education. It really shaped his decisions in his life. I think it also affected his mental health. And when I was younger, I used to think it was a really strange and unique story. But when I became a lawyer and started to see clients who were also stateless, and then when I became a legal scholar, I started to read the immense body of work that started to emerge around who are stateless and how they become stateless. I began to realize that my dad's story is quite typical and started to investigate it myself. And I think, one of the lessons that I've learned from my dad is that I think it's important to talk about it. Like, he was very open about it with me, which is very unusual for Asian parents. And in fact, a lot of people in my family who migrated to Canada to become citizens can't talk about it today. The trauma of being stateless really has prevented them from being able to do so. And so I feel duty bound to share our story, to create more awareness around the situation, and to say that it is not a strange, unique, or uncommon, and that there needs to be more attention paid to how we can resolve this issue.
Was there a little bit of shame? I know you said that your father was open about it with you, but, having this open secret within your family, did you growing up feel a little shame of that?
For sure. I felt like I was very different from other Asian families. You hear their migration stories or why they came to Canada or how they came to Canada, and mine was very different. And so personally, I did feel that. I'm sure my father felt that too, and then the ways he talks about it, I think he felt like he was treated less than human, subhuman. He used those words that he felt like he was rightsless. So it can have a profound impact on the way that people see themselves and the way that they might interact with the world.
So in that particular example with your father, born in Brunei, but what was his paperwork saying that he was from when we talk about that gaslighting?
Yeah. So his paperwork just said that he was a subject, a British protected subject, but it was, for many people who have traced British colonization and their modes of categorizing people and the ways in which they counted and conducted their census, there are categories of British subjects in law. And being a British subject didn't necessarily mean you were entitled to British citizenship or citizenship of the colony that you were in. And I think, countries like Brunei and Malaysia, the subject of my book, they inherited and incorporated the vestiges of colonial law and the ideas around hierarchies of citizenship. And so my father's story is really born out of a colonial history about the ways in which the British came, divided and separated people and categorized them, and then gave them different ideas of citizenship that have really permeated in many post-British colonial states today.
I'm curious, before we dive into the main research of your book in Malaysia, you had talked about 10 million. You referenced 10 million stateless people, many of them children. I'm curious, do we actually have confidence in that figure? Is that number smaller? Is that number bigger? Where are we getting that information data?
Yeah, that number comes from the United Nations, and it's an estimate, and they themselves don't really know the number. And the reason for that is because stateless people don't necessarily want to be counted or known to the government, because they could be detained, they could be deported to countries they've never been to. That's happened to stateless people. So the risk of coming out or being known to a government to be counted is severe, and stateless people know this, and in order to survive they kind of sometimes have to work behind the scenes or hide in the shadows, which feeds into why I use the term ghost citizen too. A lot of stateless people survive by passing through life in a ghost-like existence. So we don't really know the numbers, and my estimate is that it's much higher because of the fears and the repercussions that stateless people experience.
All right. You conducted, as you mentioned, your research for this book in Malaysia. We have a map to remind people what area of the world we're talking about. The highlighted portion here shows the two land masses that make up Malaysia, partly on the Malaya Peninsula and partly on the island of Borneo on the left over there. Why is Malaysia the right place to study this issue? Because you would think that Brunei would be the place that you would start your research, but there's some challenges there. But why Malaysia?
Yeah, I did initially want to go to Brunei, the place of my father's birth, to study this, but Brunei is not a democratic country. When I went there, there were a lot of people who told me that they were fearful of speaking openly about this issue for fear of repercussions from the Sultan of Brunei and his government there. And I completely understand that. But, my mother was born in Malaysia. I have family there. And I went there and found a vibrant advocacy network of stateless persons and lawyers, paralegals, NGOs that were working to help stateless people there. And so one of the other reasons was that Malaysia is very similar to other countries where there are large populations of stateless people. For example, a lot of post-British colonial states feature a lot of the same legal frameworks, administrative government structures that contribute to the creation and maintenance of statelessness. And so I feel like Malaysia is a nice case study upon which you could kind of take, my framing of ghost citizens and implant it on other countries to test whether or not these same modes and practices that governments are issuing against stateless people in the same ways.
You write, Canada is normalizing citizenship deprivation resulting in cases of statelessness. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so Canada is not immune from creating and maintaining statelessness in our borders. There are some very troubling cases where some people have been made stateless because they've been found inadmissible to Canada and therefore undeserving or unworthy due to, being in conflict with the law or engaging in
There's some pretty big cases
criminal.
with the Supreme Court.
Yes. and criminal behavior. But also I would say, more troubling is in the refugee law field, where people have come to seek asylum, and yet our decision makers don't really grapple or understand that statelessness in and of itself could be a factor or a reason why people should be seeking asylum. And our laws are not built to provide accommodations for stateless people in order for them to obtain status and to become regular members of our society.
All right, I want to read another excerpt from your book. It reads, "My father often said his early life as a stateless person was a purgatory. Like him, many stateless people experience an administrative death, be it at birth, at a government counter later in life, or during an encounter with police or other state authorities. Stateless persons avoid the notice of governments when they work under the table to avoid detention and possible deportation. But at other times, they want to be seen. For example, when they need healthcare, education, employment, housing, and belonging." You had mentioned a little bit about growing up and the need for that as well. Can you explain the concept of administrative death?
Yeah, I think it's one of the most interesting findings of my research is that I shadowed people going to a government counter to ask for help, to ask for forms. And in Malaysia, some people were outright denied even a form. And in Malaysia, you need a particular form to apply for citizenship. It has its own serial number. So each form is unique on its own. And so you couldn't just photocopy a form once you got one to give to people. So witnessing how the government authorities were actively denying people access to forms, giving wrong information. I saw paralegals and lawyers quote constitutional provisions in order to lobby government officials to obtain information and forms for their clients. So it's not for the faint of heart in order for some to be able to get access to the very services that we expect governments to issue towards people within their borders, right?
I'm curious, how do stateless people balance the need to be undetected by their governments with the desire to be seen and recognized by them?
Yeah, I think more and more stateless people feel that public advocacy has been a method to resolve their statelessness. I followed one particular woman who was able to resolve her statelessness, and she used public advocacy quite well. She was very articulate. She was, and her case was very sad because her administrative death happened at a government counter when a government official told her, "You don't look like a citizen. We're going to look at your birth certificate, which lists your citizenship," and they revoked it. And so there's a lot of, informal decisions made at the government counter that have substantive impacts. And I think when those things happen, stateless people find it cathartic to talk about it in the public, but also might be able to gain public attention and sympathy in order to resolve their individual cases. Having said that, it doesn't really lead to wholesale or systemic change in the system.
I'm curious about the role of international law and human rights regimes when it comes to stateless people. What can they do? Because there's lots of conventions, whether states adhere to them is a whole other thing. But yeah, what is the role?
Yeah, so one role that international law can play is, it already recognizes that there are stateless people. It recognizes that status. However, it gives a lot of prerogative power to states, like a veto power, to say we get to decide who our members are. I'd love to see a pushback in the international community with regards to the power that's given states to just deny wholesale this very powerful role in recognizing people and giving identification or legal existence, really. So, a rethinking about the ways in which we organize our communities and how people should be recognized as part of our community.
We have a few minutes left. I have a couple questions. You also use the term ghost citizens to refer to how myths about stateless people are haunting. Can you expand on that for us a little?
Yeah, I think it's very apropos to our times right now and the ways in which there's a lot of fear about, people who we may not understand are migrating, moving within our borders, and even people who are within our communities but somehow don't have the right status to be able to live like we do. So I think, the term ghost citizen really fuels and highlights the experience that some people experience in terms of how they're being described in the public. So some of them were described as foreigners and when they didn't feel like they were foreigners. Some people were described as terrorists, as criminals, as fraudsters for trying to cheat the system. These are very common words that we see in the public domain in terms of how we talk about different racialized, predominantly groups of people in many parts of the world today. And so, part of the research is a plea to kind of take a step back and say, before we use those terms, who are we really talking about? Are those fair to be using given the challenges that the state and the legal framework has put in front of them?
All right, so let's say we have the ears of some very powerful people. What should be done to improve the lives of stateless people, both in Malaysia, for example, or here in Canada?
Yeah, in Malaysia, there's been some troubling developments where there have been moves to try to amend the constitution to, create more statelessness. So I would say, hopefully, politicians there are looking at ways to reduce statelessness rather than, to close up the border, so to speak. And here in Canada, I guess I would say, to really humanize the people behind the stories that we hear. There's so much fear and I guess misunderstanding behind who are the people that are applying for status in Canada, for citizenship, and not to assume they're not from here, not to assume that they aren't, don't have a genuine or authentic connection to Canada. And I think, really need to rethink ways in which we recognize who are members of our society and, more importantly, how we treat people on a more compassionate and human level.
Jamie, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you so much for coming in and for your work as well.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure.
Appreciate it.
On June 8th at the Hamilton Museum of Seaman Technology, the Canadian Society of Contemporary Iron Art got together for a public pour. We had a pretty great turnout. It was 700 people came to see it. There was a core group of members who originated the iron pour group. They started out as a dinner party and slowly worked their way towards building a furnace. The temperature of the furnace is brought up to 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit to melt the iron. The furnace was filled with many charges of iron, all collected from radiators around southern Ontario. So there were 1,500 pounds of iron that went into it, and this is a kind of continuous feeding of the furnace throughout the day. And then as the charges fill the furnace, it's tapped, and then the molten metal pours out and enters the ladle. It's very heavy. The ladle weighs about 150 pounds when it's fully filled. The role of the people in the shovel is to protect the hand and the other molds from the pouring iron. Most of the molds that were there on the day at the Sea Museum were two-part molds. The molds are made out of a resin-bonded sand that is activated by CO2 to cure the resin within the sand. Scratch blocks are also made from the same sand. But it's an open face and it allows people to same day go in and carve the surface there and produce a piece to take home with them. And so it's a lot less prep time and more accessible, good first way to have an entry point to work with iron. It's a very unique metal to be using because it is so accessible and so affordable. You can pretty much get iron anywhere. Iron is often not even accepted by scrapyards because its value is so low. On the day of the event, when everyone comes together, you're pretty much just responding intuitively to how the metal looks, how it flows in the moment. You're looking to all these hints within the metal, within the surface as it's melting, to show you how you're going to end up responding to it. It's the surface of the metal, it's how it looks in the furnace, it's how it starts to like slowly drip out the side. These are all indications of when you're going to be coming in and ready to like tap the furnace. It's kind of a call and response between the organization of people there on the site and also a call and response with the furnace itself. This is a found frame collected with 2 river stones embedded within the center of it. And so you can see the attachment here from the gating system where the pour cup would have been outside of the sand cast. Here's where the metal fills in its molten state, and then it slowly drops down into the base here and fills out through the runners that are all these little connection points. And so it's covered in the sand, but as you work away and kind of clear it off, you end up with more of the details underneath. It's a really intuitive kind of process. Something I think about a lot is the apparent permanence of metal. It's something we think of as like rigid, unyielding, something that doesn't change much. And with this permanence, you kind of end up with its counterpart, reclaiming, reworking, melting down, tempering. All these ways that you can kind of renegotiate the material's form. It's very forgiving.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, December 5th, 2024. Tomorrow on the program, John Michael McGrath and yours truly dive into the Auditor General's report and its scathing review of the provincial government's plans for Ontario Place. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.